This amazing shot. Knight to f6 check, forcing pawn takes knight, then knight to e7 check. Today we have a game between Magnus Carlsen, the Mozart of chess, against Hans Niemann, the Beethoven of chess. Well, who gave him the name Beethoven? Well, I did just now. And why? Well, because he's got the hair. That's why. And this was a game from the FTX Crypto Cup. Magnus Carlsen has white, Hans Niemann has black, 15 minutes each side, 10-second increment. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with e4, and Hans Niemann says he's going to play the Sicilian, c5, knight f3, knight c6. Magnus plays the Rossolimo, not the open Sicilian, with bishop to b5, trying to avoid the Sveshnikov. g6 castles, bishop to g7, and rook to e1, backing up that e4 pawn, knight to f6. And now Magnus goes ahead and plays e5. Gains space, but reduces his control over the light squares a little bit. And Hans Niemann immediately jumps into the d5 square, now that he can do so. Knight to c3 challenges that knight. It would be probably an error for black to take on c3, because after pawn takes, it liberates this bishop on c1 and gives white very comfortable development. And white has a nice plus score in my database. Black played knight to c7 instead, forcing the bishop to make a choice, which Magnus does. He takes on c6. Hans Niemann takes away from the center. Usually you say take toward the center, but he wants to liberate this bishop on c8, give it mobility. Knight to e4 centralizes the knight, hits the pawn at c5, which Hans Niemann defends, but now Magnus plays knight to f6 check, and this pretty little move, is the idea behind it is this: if black takes the knight, then pawn takes pawn with check, the king has to move, and now you take the bishop, and king takes pawn. So the material is equal, but black's king is quite vulnerable. These dark squares are vulnerable, and this is not a great position for black, excuse me. So instead, Hans Niemann just moves the king over one square. He loses the right to castle, but he keeps his nice bishop at g7. Magnus says job done, moves the knight back. Bishop to g4, pinning the knight that defends the pawn on e5, d3, and the pawn at e5 could be captured here. And in fact, there's a really cool line. Magnus could actually take that bishop, sacrificing the queen, and then after bishop h6 check, king g8, knight takes c6. This is really tricky, because if Hans Niemann were to try to save his queen in this position with queen to d7, then this amazing shot, knight to f6 check, forcing pawn takes knight, then knight to e7 check, and the only way to get out of check is for the queen to take the knight. Queen takes knight, rook takes queen, and white would have a nice advantage. Instead of queen to d7, the best move for black here would just be to take on c2, and after knight takes queen, rook takes, and it is black that has a comfortable position. But instead of all of that, Hans Niemann plays knight to e6, centralizing the knight on the very comfortable e6 square. Magnus says, I don't like it there, I want it gone. He plays knight e to g5 to trade it off. Knight takes knight, bishop takes g5, queen to d5, centralizing the queen, attacking the e5 pawn. Rook to e4 counterattacks the bishop at g4, and instead of taking the knight, Hans Niemann decides to play bishop to f5, putting more pressure on this rook on e4. c4 was played. Carlsen says, I'm going to counterattack here. I'm not going to just move my rook away in a scared way. I want to counterattack. And then Hans Niemann plays queen to e6, queen to d7, rook to e3 is just an equal position. But instead, Hans Niemann plays the queen to e6, anticipating that he can play the pawns to h6 and g5 and gain space on the king side. Rook e3, h6, bishop f4, g5, bishop g3, rook to d8. And now for the next few moves, this d3 pawn becomes everything. I mean, white defends it with all of his might, black attacks it with everything he's got. h3 to stop g4, king to g8 to artificially castle. The king can go to h7, the rook can go to e8. a3, Magnus wants to undermine this pawn on c5, which is what keeps the pawn on d3 backwards. So after king h7, he plays b4. He would love for black to take on b4 and give white the flexibility of the pawn structure back. But rook to d7, he says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'd rather have isolated doubled pawns and keep your pawn fixed on d3. Queen to b3 to make room for the rook to defend. Queen to g6. Now remember what I told you. Black has 4 pieces all aimed at d3. White has 3 defending, so he needs one more. So what does he do? Knight to e1. 4 attackers, 4 defenders, all directed at the d3 square. That weakness is everything. So Hans Niemann plays h5. And if you look at this position, Black has the two bishop advantage, and now is beginning to develop kingside pressure. I have to say, Hans Niemann has won the opening battle, and Magnus has a little bit to worry about here. He could be in big trouble. The knight goes back to f3. Black plays h4, kicking the bishop back to h2. He could play e6 as an intermediate move to sort of liberate that bishop, and after bishop takes, bishop to e5. But instead, he plays the most natural move, bishop to h2, and now Black just plays e6. And that fixes this pawn as a weakness, and it blocks the bishop on h2 and reduces its mobility quite a bit. The queen goes to c3 to defend the e5 pawn. The bishop goes to f8. It indirectly defends c5. To be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure about this move. I've looked at it, studied it, can't quite tell. Maybe the idea is bishop e7 and rook back over. Turns out the bishop ends up returning to the diagonal it was on. Knight goes back to e1, and now g4, opening up lines directly against White's king. hg4, bishop takes g4. Hans Niemann could have played queen to g4. It might have even been a better move. After f3, queen to d4, he would get a queenless middle game, but now the pressure on d3 would be absolutely enormous, and White wouldn't have much counterplay. But instead, he takes with the bishop. And here, rook to d2, avoiding kingside weaknesses, was a decent alternative, but f3 was played. Kicks the bishop away, but does create some kingside weaknesses to worry about. And here, Hans Niemann plays bishop to f5. A really amazing and dynamic option was bishop to h6, immediately attacking the rook on e4. And if the rook goes to e4, watch this amazing move that Hans Niemann could have played. Queen takes e4, double exclamation point. And there's no good way for White to handle this. If he takes with the d pawn, then just rook to d1, pawn takes bishop, and then bishop to d2, counterattacking the knight and the queen. And he has a dominating position. If instead he takes with the f pawn, then bishop d1, and he has a total clamp on the position, with the bishops, the rooks hitting d3 and the two bishops, and White is just definitely better. But instead, he makes a more natural move, bishop to f5, continuing to aim at d3. Now f4, bishop to h6. So the bishop just returns to this diagonal, targets the f4 pawn, queen to a5, aims at c5, queen to g4, again piling up on this pawn, two attackers, one defender. So he adds a second defender, rook to f3, but that doesn't quite work because of this really pretty move from Hans Niemann. He plays bishop to e4, attacking the rook, and the bishop can't be taken because of the pin on the d file. Queen to c5 and bishop f3, knight f3. So basically, he just gets a pawn for the exchange, and Black is up material. h3, undermining the knight at f3, and for the moment, actually threatening mate on g2. So Magnus puts an end to that with queen to f2. Now rook to d3, rook d3, rook d3. And he's threatening to take on g2 with the pawn and then capture the knight. So you remove the defender and then you capture the knight. So the knight has to move. He goes to e1, which defends g2, counterattacks the rook on d3. Rook takes a3 with this nasty concept of bishop f8, bishop c5, and that would create all kinds of potential trouble. Queen goes to b2, attacking the rook. Rook goes to e3, counterattacking the knight. So the king goes to f2 to defend the knight. But then after bishop to f4, there are just far, far too many threats in this position. In fact, my computer says this is something like a mate in 22 or something for Black. I'm obviously not going to go through those variations. But in this game, Magnus Carlsen resigned at this point, and the Beethoven of chess actually beat the Mozart of chess in a very nice attacking game from Hans Niemann. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.